So, you want to buy a storage facility. Rows of metal doors, no tenants calling about a broken toilet at midnight, people paying you every month to store stuff they mostly forget they own. Here's the part nobody tells you. This is one of the few real estate businesses where the pitch is almost entirely true. It really is lower maintenance, lower overhead, and more resilient than almost anything else in commercial property. And that exact reputation is what quietly built one of the most overbuilt, boom and bust prone corners of American real estate. Let's start with what it costs to get into this. A single-story metal building, the industry's cheapest and most common construction type, runs somewhere between $25 and $65 per square foot to build, not including land. Go multi-story and you're looking at $45 to $90 a square foot, sometimes higher once you factor in elevators, climate control, and more expensive finishes. A fairly typical 30,000 square foot single-story facility lands you somewhere around $750,000 to $1.5 million all in. Land costs add another layer entirely, typically between $8 and $25 a square foot, depending on the market, and site development, grading, utilities, drainage adds another $4 to $8 a square foot on top of that. This is not a cheap business to enter. It's a cheap business to run once you're in it, which is a very different thing. Now, where does the revenue actually come from? Almost entirely from monthly rent priced per square foot per year, and the range is enormous. Suburban markets typically see $8 to $15 a square foot annually, while urban markets with less available land can command $15 to $25. Climate-controlled units carry a premium of 15 to 30% over standard space, since a portion of every market genuinely needs that protection for furniture, electronics, or documents. A well-run facility with a smart mix of unit sizes, roughly 30% small units, half medium, a fifth large, can stabilize at an occupancy rate somewhere between 85 and 95%. Get there, and net operating income typically lands somewhere between $8 and $15 per rentable square foot annually, which is what actually determines how the property gets valued, since storage facilities generally sell for somewhere between 8 and 12 times their net operating income. Here's the part of the pitch that happens to be genuinely true, and it's why this industry has attracted so much institutional money over the past 2 decades. Storage facilities really do run with dramatically lower overhead than almost any other commercial real estate type. There are no tenants to manage in any meaningful sense, no plumbing to fix inside individual units, minimal staffing, sometimes none at all, with modern remote monitoring technology. Combined maintenance and utilities typically run just $2 to $4 a square foot a year. Well-run facilities routinely post profit margins between 40 and 60%, a number that would be extraordinary in almost any other segment of real estate. That combination, low build complexity, plus low ongoing overhead, plus a genuinely recession-resistant demand driver, people move, downsize, divorce, and die in good economies and bad ones alike, is exactly what built the modern self-storage industry, and it's worth understanding where that idea actually came from. In 1972, a real estate developer named Wayne Hughes and his partner Kenneth Volk put up $50,000, $25,000 each to open a single self-storage facility in El Cajon, California. It wasn't even meant to be a permanent business. The original plan was to use the land as a temporary income generator while they waited for a better long-term development opportunity to come along. That first facility broke even within 3 months, at just 35% occupancy. Hughes later summarized the entire insight in one sentence. "I saw a method of holding prime land with income. Building and maintaining a storage facility costs 35 to 40% less than an equivalent apartment or office building, while renting for a comparable price per square foot. The land underneath it kept appreciating the entire time, largely untouched by the wear and tear that comes with actual tenants living or working inside a building." Hughes and Volk turned that single facility into public storage, which grew to 1,000 locations by 1989, went public as a REIT in 1995, and today operates more than 2,800 facilities, generating well over $3 billion in annual revenue, still the largest self-storage company on earth. That success story is precisely why so much capital poured into this industry over the following decades, and precisely why the sector eventually built the conditions for its own periodic crashes. Because storage facilities are relatively cheap and fast to build compared to almost any other commercial property type, typically 8 to 12 months from groundbreaking to opening for a single-story facility, developers can flood a promising market with new supply far faster than that market's actual demand can catch up. This isn't a new problem. The industry went through it after the dot-com crash in the early 2000s, when facilities in overbuilt markets were limping along at 55% occupancy. It happened again after 2008, and it's happening again right now. In 2023 alone, more than 98 million square feet of new self-storage space came onto the market nationwide, with over 4,700 properties under construction at once. Abandoned storage developments, projects started and then simply walked away from, rose by more than 100% in a single recent year, and deferred projects climbed by 44%. Sunbelt boomtowns like Atlanta, Charlotte, and Orlando got so flooded with new supply that revenue growth across major storage REITs turned negative, driven by declining occupancy and falling rental rates in exactly the markets that had looked most promising just a few years earlier. Here's the trap that catches storage operators who scale too fast during a boom. And it isn't oversupply on its own. It's oversupply combined with debt leverage in a business that suddenly can't generate the cash flow the loan assumed it would. Great Value Storage, an affiliate of a larger holding company that once operated dozens of self-storage facilities across multiple states, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, listing assets between $100 and $500 million against liabilities between $50 and $100 million. The filing came in the middle of a foreclosure battle with a major institutional lender that had been underway since 2019. Severe winter weather had badly damaged several of the company's Texas facilities, and the operator argued in court that selling the properties immediately would mean an unfairly depressed price, since the storm damage hadn't been fully repaired. A judge disagreed, ruling that the argument wasn't supported by the evidence presented. By that point, affiliated entities under the same ownership had filed more than 20 separate bankruptcies, tangled in overlapping legal disputes with a real estate investment firm and a nonprofit foundation, on top of an earlier, unrelated FBI raid on the company's offices years before. Here's the structural lesson underneath that collapse. None of it happened because storage demand disappeared. People were still moving, still downsizing, still needing space. It happened because a highly leveraged portfolio expanded rapidly across many properties in many states, met a moment of genuine operational stress, storm damage on some properties, a hostile lender relationship on others, and simply didn't have the equity cushion or the cash flow flexibility to absorb it. A storage business with almost no debt can weather a bad occupancy year without much drama because the fixed costs are so low to begin with. A storage business carrying tens of millions of dollars in leverage against dozens of properties doesn't have that same room to breathe. The low overhead that makes this business so attractive in good years is exactly what makes over-leveraged operators assume they can keep expanding indefinitely, right up until a lender, a storm, or a court ruling proves otherwise. Now compare that to what Wayne Hughes actually built, because the contrast isn't really about ambition. It's about how each operation was financed and paced. Public Storage's early growth was funded conservatively and methodically, expanding into major metropolitan markets deliberately, rather than chasing every available site during a boom. Between 1978 and 1989, the company raised roughly $3 billion from more than 200,000 individual investors through real estate limited partnerships, a financing structure that spread risk across a huge base of capital rather than concentrating it in a small number of highly leveraged loans against a small number of properties. By the time storage cycles turned down, as they periodically do, Public Storage had the scale, the diversification, and the balance sheet to simply keep operating through the downturn, rather than being forced into a fire sale by a single lender relationship going bad. Hughes himself was famously debt-averse throughout his career, a trait people close to him traced directly back to watching his own family lose everything during the Dust Bowl. That instinct, avoid leverage that could wipe you out in a bad cycle, turned out to be exactly the discipline this particular business rewards most. The difference between these two outcomes wasn't the underlying real estate. Storage facilities in Texas and storage facilities in California are fundamentally the same kind of asset. Cheap metal boxes generating rent from people who need somewhere to put their stuff. The difference was capital structure and growth discipline. One operator built slowly, diversified its funding across hundreds of thousands of small investors, and treated the low overhead nature of the business as a cushion to be preserved. The other expanded rapidly across many properties using concentrated debt. And when a combination of storm damage, legal disputes, and a strained lender relationship arrived simultaneously, that same low overhead business model had no cushion left to absorb the shock. That brings us to the structural risk sitting underneath this entire industry. And it isn't demand, which genuinely is about as recession-resistant as commercial real estate gets. It's supply, and specifically, how easy and cheap this asset class is to overbuild relative to almost any other property type. A cheap, fast construction timeline that looks like an advantage during a lease-up phase becomes exactly the mechanism that floods a hot market with too much competing supply within a couple of years, which is precisely why this industry has now gone through the same oversupply cycle 3 separate times in roughly 2 decades. Zoom out across the industry, and the pattern becomes obvious. The storage operators who thrive across full market cycles are almost never the ones expanding fastest during the boom years. They're the ones who stayed disciplined about leverage, diversified their funding base, and treated every hot market with genuine skepticism about how long that heat would actually last before new supply caught up. The operators who fail are almost always the ones who scaled aggressively on borrowed money right as a market was peaking, only to discover that the same low fixed costs that made the business so appealing in the first place also meant there was very little operational flexibility to absorb a lender dispute, a natural disaster, or a wave of new competing supply hitting all at once. So does owning a storage facility actually work as a business? The honest answer is that the underlying economics are genuinely about as favorable as commercial real estate gets. Low construction complexity, low ongoing overhead, resilient demand that barely cares what the broader economy is doing. But that same favorability is exactly what periodically floods the market with more supply than it can absorb, and exactly what tempts disciplined operators into becoming undisciplined ones. In the optimistic version, you build or acquire methodically, keep leverage conservative, and let low overhead and steady demand compound quietly for decades. The way Wayne Hughes turned a $50,000 bet on a single facility into the largest storage company in the world. In the realistic bad version, you scale aggressively during a boom on borrowed money, and when the inevitable oversupply cycle arrives, or a storm hits, or a lender turns hostile, you discover that the business's greatest strength, how little it costs to run, was never actually protection against how much debt you'd stacked on top of it. Neither outcome has much to do with how many units are rented on the day you buy the place. A storage facility was never really a complicated business to run. The complexity was always in how patiently and how conservatively you were willing to grow it.